Welcome back to Vector Lab. In this video, we're going to discuss all the aspects that play a role into agent monitoring and evaluation for GenAI systems. And with us, we have Eric Peters. So Eric, can you introduce a bit yourself?
Yeah, for sure. What's my background? So I've been in the Gen AI space, I guess, since the Gen AI space started. But before that, I was kind of doing machine learning for a long while, particularly in the enterprise space. So have built kind of search and recommendation systems for enterprises. In the Gen AI space, I've done kind of all aspects of infrastructure from vector search as well as kind of like agent serving. But the majority of my time in the Gen AI space has been kind of centered around evaluation and quality. And really kind of how do you help a developer know what is the accuracy of their bot? Okay, so it's bad, which is usually the answer most of the time. How do I actually improve it? And then okay, once I've got it to a place where I'm comfortable, how do I monitor it and keep it going? Been doing that for, I guess, as long as you can in the Gen AI space. Yeah, and then before I started doing AI things, I trained as a computer scientist and spent a bunch of time on the dark side as a consultant. But yeah, so
You've been through everything, literally. In which case, my question is, what drew you to this agent evaluation space?
I mean, I think honestly, it was just the fact that customers kept telling us that they couldn't get the quality that they needed. And that, as a product guy, that kind of drew me to like, okay, well, what can we actually do to help them? So it was organic, right? It wasn't like I woke up one day dreaming that I would, start working on Gen AI evaluation. It was more that we, were like, wow, these like customers really can't get the accuracy of these bots to work. And, there's no tooling that really works well out there. So yeah, that's kind of why I started building in the space.
Nice segue into our first question around challenges. So, what
Yeah.
are the biggest pain points that you've seen that teams face when they try to debug and monitor Gen AI systems in production?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the pain point is that's the biggest has kind of changed over the past year and a half or two. Maybe like a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, it would have been like, I don't even know how to measure it. Like, what is it? Like, what's the right metric? Like, what do I do? But I think the industry and folks have kind of figured that challenge out at this point, right? There are well-defined metrics. You kind of there's an oiled, I wouldn't say completely well-oiled process, but there's a process that you can follow. Honestly, today, that the biggest challenge that I've heard from folks is just drowning in the amount of data that they have, right? So yeah, my bot's in pre-production or for a lucky few in production, and 1,000 people used it. Okay, like what's wrong with it? What's working well? How do I actually read those 1,000 traces or those 1,000 conversations and figure out what's happening? And then, for those who actually are willing to spend the time to read them, which I highly recommend, okay, well, like, what's the biggest issues? Like, what's the root cause that I should actually go after? And so it's still a pretty laborious process now that we've kind of figured out a lot of the primitives. So I'd say, yeah, just like the amount of time that it takes, being able to like read 1,000 conversations and extract insight, that's just like a hard task for anyone. So yeah.
So then from a point where we didn't really know how to evaluate, now we have too much data to evaluate and we don't know how to use this data well for evaluation. Interesting. And so that takes us nicely into tracing as well, because
Yeah.
the solution or kind of the solution is tracing all of these answers. So if we think about tracing, what can it help us uncover? What kind of issues? What kind of signals?
I mean, yeah, I guess if I tie it back to that previous challenge, and I guess like for those who aren't familiar with tracing, right? Like tracing actually as a concept has been around for many, many years, right? Like OpenTelemetry, Datadog, Dynatrace, App Dynamics, right? People have been tracing their applications forever. And what does a trace give you? A trace is essentially like, hey, I have some very complicated distributed system, and it's calling it a bunch of different systems, and I need one view that says, okay, this is where the user entered, and then these are all the different things that happen. And so, Gen AI kind of, I think, has co-opted tracing as its own brand new thing, but in reality, tracing is not a brand new thing. It just became really, really useful in the Gen AI concept, where kind of like it actually was more useful offline in the beginning, whereas distributed tracing, kind of tended to be more of an online thing. But yeah, so like in a trace, like what you want is you want to have, this is where the user started. So what was the user's input to the application? And then you want the end to be, okay, what was returned back to the user? And so inside that trace, if you will, right, you're going to have what LLMs were called, how many tokens were used, what, what if any exceptions were thrown, what data was retrieved from a database, or what API calls, what tools, et cetera, right? So pretty much everything in your application. So where does that information become useful to kind of come back to your question? Like, it's super useful for like the very obvious use cases of I need to debug latency or I need to debug errors, right? If I have an exception, it was thrown and it's captured in the trace, great, it's there, I can look at it. But it also becomes really helpful when you're trying to debug, like what the heck is happening? Why is the LLM giving this response versus that response? Because then you can actually see like, this is the system prompt that was put in. This is the context we put into that prompt. Well, the tool was called with these parameters, and okay, I can now start to understand these things. So it's super helpful for always looking at one. I think like if we go back to the challenge, I think what we're going to start seeing people do more and more of actually is have agents, or like really not agents, like reasoning models start to read these traces and start to tell you what's wrong and then start to extract patterns over time, just because like that's actually something that LLMs are really good at. They can look at something and understand what's happening. So it's essentially a summarization task, but yeah.
So interesting. Sorry, to add the point there, I was in a conference speaking about how you can trace tool calling in agents. And then the question was, imagine if your agent is calling different tools and there is a huge, chain of calling tools. Like, how would you trace that? And how can you take this back and actually make sense of it? And I think this is the answer, right? Having a reasoning model reason through all of these paths that the model took and the tool calling it to come to an answer, because it's not easy to do it otherwise.
Yeah. The only thing that I would caution is that I think I could see how some could interpret my comment as don't bother reading the trace, go just have Claude or Sonnet or whatever, Opus 4.1 read it for you. I cannot recommend enough actually reading a bunch of traces out of your application. Like spend 20 minutes every day reading a random sample of 15. It is amazing how much intuition you will get. And then use the reasoning model to see if those patterns exist across 1,000 traces. But don't give up on the like reading. Like that's your intuition. That's what makes you a data scientist or makes you an AI engineer, whatever title we're using for people these days. So yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes customers don't think much about tracing, but then something goes wrong and they have no idea what went wrong. And it can go wrong in so many different places, even if it's a simple RAG app. And so that's when they realize that they actually do need that. And they're like, please, I don't understand what went wrong. So that's a really good point to keep in mind. Just going back to what you were saying about, like, one of the challenges being that sometimes you have to deal with thousands of millions of requests. If you had any advice to give in a couple minutes on design patterns that can help keep tracing overhead manageable, conscious this could be a whole hour topic, but any advice that you can give?
Yeah, I guess like just to make sure I understand, you mean in terms of like the latency of like how it impacts the application, or like the server side infrastructure to be able to ingest all of those?
I think yes. How do you manage to go from a prototype to production where you're going to have thousands or millions of requests? And your point about how do you manage to have production traces versus the initial eval, data set that you may have curated?
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I guess like, first of all, like I think most tracing implementations at this point, like don't really, they have a very minimal latency impact. It's not that they don't have an impact, but a very, very minimal latency impact. And then on the server side, right? How do I ingest these? How do I, make sense of them, right? Like there's some basic primitives that you need there, right? Like obviously you need some type of system that can ingest at a high volume or high QPS, actually pretty hefty weight data, because some of these traces can get pretty large, particularly when you're doing multimodal, where you have these deep reasoning agents. That's part one. And then part two is like, on the other side, you want some type of search and indexing infrastructure. Right. And what do I mean by that? Like you want a way to be able to filter. These traces have a bunch of spans and attributes on them. You want a way to easily filter on those. You want a way to easily do full text search on that. A lot of folks are using like some type of click house or something like that. But having that type of system and making sure that it can actually scale up to what your expected volume of QPS is really important. Obviously, like all the tracing vendors out there can give you that, right? I know OpenAI has one, Databricks has one, the litany of startups out there that have one. All the clouds have their version of tracing as well. There's plenty of options out there. But yeah, just making sure that it can support your scale of ingest, and then it's got the right kind of user experience on the other side for search and filtering. Honestly, that second part's probably more important than the first part. Like, I doubt that anyone's not going to be able to support your scale at this point, unless you're going like for the startup that was started yesterday that forgot to scale up their stuff. But yeah.
So how do automated LLM judges or other automated graders help teams achieve scalable quality assurance?
That's a great question. I think that, well, let's just take a step back. So what exactly does an LLM judge do? And I think like the LLM judge is essentially just right, like it's an LLM that's reading some other output and making an assessment on it. And like the question that I get, like it's interesting to see teams kind of go through the journey, because like teams who've never touched an LLM judge before, usually they'll say something like, Eric, like that's ridiculous. Like, how can the LLM judge its own outputs? Like, it's going to be biased and crazy. And then like that same team, like 3 months later, they'll come back like, oh my God, LLM judge has changed our workflow. We don't have to read everything manually. So I think it's just worth calling out the intuition of an LLM judge. And I think for me, the intuition is that it's really easy to be a critic. And what do I mean by that, right? Like, you can write, maybe you're a PhD student and you write your dissertation. I definitely couldn't write a PhD dissertation, but I guarantee you I can critique someone's dissertation. And I'll have tons of opinions about, what does and doesn't make sense to me, right? So it's much easier to be a critic than it actually is to be a content creator. And so that's kind of the intuition, right? If you have a powerful enough model, right, it can critique something, even in fact, if it's same output or the same LLM. Of course, there's like a little bit of statistics, then maybe you don't want but like don't want the same LLM judging the other LLM. But like at the end of the day, the pattern works. So with that, I think now, what does an LLM judge actually do, and how does it actually help you scale evaluation? Well, like if you don't have an LLM judge, what you're going to be doing is reading a trace and saying, okay, on this criteria, did it or did it not achieve this outcome? And so an LLM judge essentially helps you automate. And the place where those actually become really, really helpful is if you can start to align them with your domain experts. So usually if you write like an evaluation criteria, maybe like, I don't know, what's a good one? Like the chatbot is polite and pleasant. It's a pretty easy one. What does polite and pleasant mean? Like, I mean, maybe that's obvious, but like it might need something that's a little bit different for AT&T than for Verizon, than for T-Mobile. And so out of the box, your LLM judge probably will be like 60, 70% of the way right. But then you need to start thinking about, okay, how do I get it to, 80 or 90% right? So it actually can truly be a helpful metric that I can rely on and use it as a filter to say, okay, I'm going to go for the ones that aren't polite and pleasant and figure out why they're not polite and pleasant, so that I can then go make prompt tweaks or tweaks to the agent's logic to try to fix that issue, and then use that to retest. So in summary, what does it give you? It gives you essentially a way to automatically judge or automatically assess outputs from your LLM, which then enables you to try more different ideas without having to read them manually, so that you can hill climb on those quality metrics faster.
Which answers our question why traditionally manual QA is not enough, because then you can't go through all of these examples and you can't come up with all of these different ideas. Okay, and then another question which I love is, who owns or who defines these new scorers or judges? Back to the SME that you said before, like a specific SME. Is it a business specific SME? Is it a developer? Who is it? And what are any learnings there from working with different customers?
Yeah. I mean, I think so look, if you have a use case where it's a business use case, right? Like you actually have like some business value that you're trying to drive. To me, the anti-pattern is to go shove the developer in a corner and have them define all the evaluation criteria. And the analogy I would use here is like, think about like the most common use case I hear is like some type of call center or customer support automation. Like if you were training brand new call center reps and bringing a new call center online, like there would obviously be someone who is like an expert in your domain or in customer support who would be there and be like, okay, well, the procedures that they need to run are X, Y, and Z. And like, hey, like a good answer for these people, for these types of calls is X and Y and A and B. That's the same thing that you need to do here. There's no difference. I mean, yes, there's obviously a lot of difference between human and an LLM, but like there's no difference in how you should think about like evaluating and training those things. And so therefore, like, yes, you need to have your business experts involved in defining that evaluation criteria. Now, What does that mean? It doesn't mean the opposite should not happen, which is the developer says, it's completely your problem. You go and figure out the evaluation criteria and come back to me. That developer is going to be really unhappy on the other side because they're going to get a bunch of stuff. And so it needs to be a collaborative process where you kind of work back and forth. And like often, like for me, I think the best practice here is like work back and forth, not in the abstract, but actually work back and forth. Like, hey, have a little bit of like, it needs to be polite, it needs to be pleasant, it needs to be accurate. What are some of the high level things? But then actually work on specific examples, like actual traces, because that then helps elicit, kind of exactly what's happening and what's right or wrong. And like again, the intuition here is like, if you come to me and you're like, Eric, please tell me all of the quality best practices that you've seen over the past 2 years, I'd be like, I don't know, I could come up with like one or two off the top of my head. But then if you actually took me and you're like, hey, Eric, I'm going to show you like all, like go one by one and go through each customer that you worked with. I'm like, oh, yeah, for them, they had this and this. And for these guys, they had this and this. And for these guys, they had this and this. And so that's the same intuition here with like looking at individual traces with business experts. You can start to define that evaluation criteria in a lot easier way. Just because of the human recall problem.
Is there then more work that has to be done on the business specific judges rather than, for example, quality? All of these things are kind of predefined. The things that the developer would check, I feel, usually are predefined, and they're already part of most of the platforms, right? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're thinking of things like groundedness or like hallucination metric. I mean, yes, I think some of the here's the thing is like the trap that I hear from someone was like, we just want everything out of the box. We want all the metrics out of the box. And honestly, like I'll give you an example, like answer relevance. I think every single LLM quality platform has answer relevance in it at this point. I worked with a customer. They said answer relevance isn't working for us. Why not? Like, well, it keeps flagging these questions where we say that they're a financial services company, where we say we can't provide financial advice is not relevant. Like, well, the guy asked for financial advice. That's not relevant. They're like, no. That's a super relevant answer because from our legal department, we can't provide stock advice. And so even for those simple out of the box metrics that like seemingly are like, oh yeah, it should be obvious and it should be the same everywhere, there is a lot of business specific aspects to it. Same with like groundedness, right? Like, like how like like if you're responding based on questions, it's the basic things like, did you make up facts or not make up facts? But like there may be some like nuance to like, hey, like you can actually like there's some logic that can be applied and some rules that are actually okay with LLM can go off of the facts and not be directly citing. And so I think that those metrics that are out of the box will get you started and they'll like give you something to work on. But ultimately, you're going to need to iterate with business stakeholders, whoever is like the expert in that domain, to really get those metrics to a point where you can like trust, rely, and hill climb and improve quality off of.
So we've established that doing manual QA of GenAI outputs is not a good solution necessarily, especially in production, and that we should use LLM judges, etc. But how could team mitigate the risks around reliability or bias when using automated judges?
Yeah, great question. And just to be clear, like I actually don't think manual QA is bad. I think manual QA is great. And I would encourage everyone to do it and to have their business stakeholders and their developers do manual QA. And the reason for that is not because it's the scalable solution, but because you need to have intuition about how these things are responding and how they're operating. And so Laura, like what I'd say is actually like some of the ways there's like probably some technical things that I could throw out there, like, how do you measure bias and but like, look, at the end of the day, like, the concern that I hear from people is like, okay, like, is the thing going to become biased or do something that's not aligned with my business? And what's the best way to do that is to make sure that your automated evaluation criteria aligns with what your business wants. And what's the best way to do that is some continual form of manual QA to make sure that those metrics are up to date and actually reflective of what your business standards are. Like, there's not like shortcuts to I don't know, there's some analogy that I could come up with here, but like, if you want good quality, it requires work. And like, there's no easy button, and anyone who's selling you the button that you just press and you magically get quality on the other side, like I would run very far away from that vendor. You have to like define what quality is. So, yeah.
So on this defining what quality is, usually customers start with creating or curating an evaluation dataset, right? So that is one way to define what are the things my app should respond well to. But also there's a way of actually piloting this collecting some traces and then turning this into evaluation data set. So what is the difference between the two, and how do these two merge at the end of the day?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and I think like, right, if you kind of go back to like the traditional days of ML, if you will, right? Like the pattern very much was like, yeah, let's go collect some type of training set and some type of testing set, and let's use that and let's train against it, and then we'll put it in production. And I think I've seen some customers like to kind of do that more in the earlier days of Gen AI. And I think what most folks kind of, came to the conclusion was that if you go curate an evaluation data set, you end up making up a bunch of stuff that's not really the same as what will be asked in production. And so you have these like artificial data sets, and then you put it in production or even like pre-production, like, oh my God, they're like asking different questions. But so Maria, like, can come back to your question, like, yeah, you probably want to seed at the start with 5, 10, 15, 20, just to like get the thing going. But then as quickly as you can put it, even in front of like business experts, you can act like they're real users. You will start to see how people ask different questions, right? Like no one's going to be like, can you please explain my bill from yesterday? It has an overage, right? No one's going to say that. It's going to be like, F you, my bill's too high. And like, maybe they won't be as rude. Hopefully they won't be that rude.
Hopefully
But
not.
hopefully not that rude. But right, they're going to be like, bill too high. Or they're going to say something much shorter or much, and so like, how do you actually have this right quote unquote distribution of data from production? And so that's where you start to get the cycle where you can, hey, you seed a few to get yourself started, then you start collecting examples from production, putting those back into your evaluation data set, using that and kind of keeping that virtuous cycle. And like back to our manual QA point, like, yeah, as you keep finding those that are good examples, keep them. It's a process of continuous care and feeding of that evaluation data.
Can I ask a follow-up here? So there was this question that then if you keep updating this evaluation data set, how can you compare between model versions, right? So model A was evaluated on dataset A, then this dataset expanded, drifted. How my model B, now we can say it performs better given that the dataset has changed.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is definitely why you need dataset versioning and lineage tracking and all those boring enterprise governance things that are actually super important. But look, like from a physical, simple standpoint, right? You could just compare the subset of the questions. But like my sense is that like you could always rerun the old version of the model and the new stuff. Like in my way, like I'm not as worried about that like type of drift because like rerun the old model or like you're at the new version. So I don't think of that as big of a concern. But if someone is concerned about it, right, there are like you could be like, okay, I have these 10 and these 10 and
Yeah.
ignore. But yeah.
Yeah, you can keep like some common questions across the data set over time.
But yeah, you definitely need lineage tracking, right? You need some type of data platform to like, not just like, okay, what's this file? Like I've seen people do it in data platform. I've seen people do it in Git, but whatever your method for version tracking, if you need some way of doing it.
Next question. How do you think about trade-offs between evaluation costs, so meaning human review, compute, and breadth of coverage? I'm interested to know, like, have you seen with customers sometimes that they underestimate the cost that it's going to be? And, they start with, let's have this amount of resources doing evaluation. And most of the time, this is not enough, or, that it doesn't cover enough. How are people thinking about those trade-offs?
Yeah. I mean, there's still obviously a spectrum of GenAI use cases out there, right? And so like, we talked a lot about evaluation. There are definitely like plenty of use cases out there where like having a full evaluation pipeline and thousands of questions and thousands of business experts doing something, this doesn't make sense, right? It's like, hey, this is a super simple HR chatbot. Like we just need to like make sure that it doesn't crazy hallucinate and like it's got a big warning on the bottom. Like if it says you have a bunch of vacation and you don't, like you can't sue us, right? And so like there's a trade-off here, but like, then as you think about like these like major production use cases where you're like actually putting like a chatbot into the wild to your customers and it's going to make statements and like, the classic, whatever, the Canadian, I forget what airline was forced to give a refund or like sell the car. I don't know, something like that, right? Like everyone loves that example. So I do think like it is like I've seen most people kind of underestimate the amount of like human labor that it takes to get these things right. And like, frankly, not only the amount of like developer time, but also the amount of like business time and commitment to that problem. And so like, what does it come back to, Laura? I'd say is like, think really hard about what the business case is before you jump in. And like, make sure you actually have a business case for this. And if you go put a bunch of time into it, it's going to work well. And you're going to be happy with whatever metric you drive on the other side. And you know what metric you're trying to drive on the other side. That's almost like generic advice for like anything that you do in business. But like, it's surprising to me how many times I see like teams like, yeah, we're working on this use case and this use case and this other use case. I'm like, what's the business value? Oh, we don't know yet. Like, do you have
Oh.
an idea? I'm like, they're like, no, wait. I'm like, okay, well, like, it's an exploration. I'm like, okay, well, cool that it's an exploration, but like, like your salaries are paid because you drive ROI. Like, shouldn't you want the answer to that question now?
Yeah, I think it's that, and also not starting with a baseline is a common scenario that I see where they have an idea of the KPI, but they don't know where they start and where they need to finish. So then I just try to say, yeah, before we jump into fine tuning and doing all sorts of crazy things, let's just start at the beginning.
That's a really good point too, because like if you don't have a baseline, you don't know what you're improving, right? Like GenAI is never going to be perfect. No non-deterministic ML system will ever be perfect. And if you don't know the baseline and you don't know what you got to, like actually there might be business value even with it being wrong some of the time, right? Like that actually might be okay, Laura. I think that's a really great point for folks to like internalize. Like it's about improvement. It's not about perfection.
What if the baseline, it is not a GenAI based baseline, but it is actually the manual work that someone was doing? Have you faced that? Like we're comparing against what a human is doing versus what a version A of a GenAI system would do.
Yeah, I mean the thing, like I feel like one financial services company, they did this. They were I think it was an insurance company. They were like, I don't know, they had some manual processes for extracting information from PDF files, right? Kind of like pretty typical for a financial services company. And I think what they were surprised at was that the humans weren't as good as they thought they were.
Oh.
And right, like it's like the assumption is, oh, if the humans did it, it's perfect. And like, no, the reality is like, no, that's not true. Like the humans are not 100% accurate either. And so like now we need Gen AI to be 100% accurate. It's like, well, that's just not, first of all, that's unrealistic. But second of all, like, again, like, so even just measuring the human baseline can be an insightful exercise. Like, if you have 5 people read everyone, like you're going to find some places where like, yeah, someone made a mistake. They forgot a decimal point. Or
Yeah.
like they fat fingered 7 rather than 8, like.
Or they can be
Very good
biased
point.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you were advising a new Gen AI team starting today, what are the 2, 3 principles that you'd emphasize for building trustworthy evaluation pipelines?
Yeah. I mean, so like just to reiterate some of the earlier point, like make sure you know the ROI, make sure you're working on a real use case that has business value so you're not wasting your time. And that the first principle that I'd say is like go define your goals and your business requirements. Like understand what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to do. 2 is then like get a POC in the simplest form out into the hands of at least ideally some real users, but at least some testing users or internal experts so that you can start seeing how the system works. And so like that's really important. Start as simple as possible. Like people have a tendency to over engineer, like, oh, I heard about multi-agent RL. I want to do that. I mean, dude, just do a simple prompt first if you can and maybe have a tool or two. So start simple and get it out. And then once you have that simple prototype out, like I said, second principle, start reading, start looking at those traces. You're not going to shortcut that. And then as you start reading those and you start seeing the failure modes, you can start quantifying, you start automating some of the evaluation and using LLM judges, but start simple first. Start getting intuition around how that thing's working. And then finally, like, remember, it's a journey. Like you're not going to like go do 2 sprints and your product's going to be done. Like you're going to go do 2 sprints and you'll have a POC. And then there'll need to be continuous iteration on it. So, make sure you have clear goals. Make sure you have people kind of starting as simple as possible and reading traces and iteratively defining eval criteria. And then, yeah, it's a journey. You're not going to land this in a week.
Yes, and they keep it simple, right? So keep it simple overall as whatever you are architecting, just keep it simple. Get the first version out there. Yeah, I totally agree. So an interesting question now. So what is a quality signal you wish you could measure, but you can't yet?
That's a great question. What is the quality signal I wish I could measure, but I think like I would love to see just one Uber metric that could say like successful conversation or unsuccessful conversation. I think getting to that is really, really, it's hard to get there. But like, I mean, I'm hopeful that like at some point we'll get there with the tech. But like again, right back to the simplest thing. Like, if I can just have a metric that this conversation failed or this conversation succeeded, and I can trust that, then that could help me prioritize what I need to do next.
Yeah.
But yeah, getting that I think is like even pretty hard today. Uh,
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Because it could be a combination of assessments, right?
I think that's what we see most people doing now.
And now a topic that software engineers don't like, which is probably change management a bit. So with organizational blind spots like governance or incentives or culture most often sabotage otherwise well-designed evaluation systems, in your opinion?
Good question. I think in some ways it goes back to the alignment between your data science, your engineering org, and your business org. And like the failure modes are like when the business says things like it has to be 100% accurate, and the Gen AI org doesn't push back on that. It's like, no, like that's not possible. And so like, how do you actually get alignment between like what's realistic today, right? It's hard. This is a journey. This is not something we're gonna do in 2 weeks, and like, oh my God, ChatGPT in our business and we can fire half of the customer support people. Like, that's not going to happen. And so how do you have that alignment between like, yeah, this is a journey, these are the realistic expectations for what we can do, and then like this will be hard work between both teams to actually get these use cases to work. Excuse me. I think like not having that is where I start to see like, that's where the executives are like, stupid GenAI didn't actually deliver business value. And the data scientists like, these guys don't get it. They just don't get what we're doing. It's really, I'm like, how do you get that alignment is super, super important. Whether you do that through like having external consultants come in and teach both sides how to work with each other, or like having really good senior leaders on either side that kind of get that. Yeah, super, super important.
I was
I would say the same, like, unless you have found a way to communicate or align the business people who need to sign it off at the end of the day and the technical people. It's a no-go. It's like a qualification question to engage or not.
And when I also used to work in consulting, and at that time, I remember pitching to a customer and a competitor also pitching to that same customer were claiming at the time it was more, traditional ML because it was before GenAI, but they were claiming to be able to have 100% accuracy. And that's when I realized the technical part is one aspect, but actually marketing, translating complex ideas into concepts that a business stakeholder can understand is almost as crucial, especially if you're in a competitive environment and you want, your project to win, but also internally, if you want buy-in, if you want budget and resources, you need to be able to translate what you're doing. And often marketing is a bit underestimated by software engineers and technical folks in general. So that's a really good point.
Yep. Marketing. The world runs on marketing. You can have the best product, but if you don't tell anyone about it, it doesn't matter.
True. Cool. So we have time for one more question, no?
Sure.
So where do you see the biggest opportunities for innovation in GenAI evaluation for the next coming years?
Yeah. I think like maybe there's like near term and then like maybe slightly longer term. I do think we're gonna see a wave of these like agents for agent evaluation, if you will, like kind of what I was mentioning, like you have reasoning models that are gonna be able to help you understand and root cause and prioritize. And I think like we're already kind of starting to see some of that stuff come out from the various vendors, and I suspect that's gonna become a huge thing in the next year. And that's honestly going to be great because it's going to, kind of accelerate what a developer on their own can do. As long as, again, they use the tools in the right way and they don't just blindly press the button. I think like a bit longer term, like, call it a few years out, like at least what I would really love to see is how do you actually allow these business stakeholders or these people defining these use cases to define their evaluation criteria without actually having to tell them that they're defining their evaluation criteria. And what do I mean by that? Like, I don't think anyone and no business person wakes up in the morning and is like, wow, I'm so excited to define the evaluation criteria for my business use case today. They think they wake up and say, hey, like these are the business outcomes that I want to drive. This is what I want to achieve. And this is like what I need to do. This is my job to be done, if you will. And so I think that right now we have a very heavyweight process for doing that for small number of use cases where there's significant value. But I think if we can find the software and the patterns and the user experience for enabling the business person to define their evaluation criteria without realizing that they're defining their evaluation criteria for their ad hoc agent, like I need to get reports of my sales from today. They're the standard business processes that they do every day. Once they can, there's a UX and an experience that allows them to define that. We can actually start to do really interesting things technically on the back end. You can start to say, I actually can do RL at a micro level because I have a well-defined reward function that I can trust. But until you solve that UX of getting, again, the business person to do it without realizing they're doing it, I don't think you're going to unlock that ability to do evaluation truly at scale, like across all of the use cases and truly drive that value. So I don't know if that's where we'll go. That's where I will probably be pushing the world to go as much as I can. So I think that's where there's going to be a lot of value that can come out of Gen AI. But yeah.
Because as of now, the only way is to get the pilot out there and let them know that they are evaluating specific criteria, or create some guidelines for some things they want to evaluate.
Yeah, like as a simple example, like like one of the workflows I do very often is I talk to a customer and I'm like, okay, I need to like share notes with my team. Right. And so like, wouldn't it be great like if I could create an agent that like was able to take the transcript and write the notes? And like, yeah, you say, oh, you put it in chat, you can, but like, I've done that and like you still need to edit a lot and like it's not quite exactly how I'd make the notes and like it doesn't quite get the gist. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to. But like I'm implicitly defining evaluation criteria in the fact that I'm iterating back and forth with that agent and then kind of modifying my final artifact. Like that shouldn't I should be able to continue doing that same process. And on the back end, there should be these evaluation criteria. Like the TLDR is always super punchy and mentions the key, thing and like, nor the fact that, they talked about something that was off topic of the interview guy. Right? Like you can think of all these evaluation criteria that implicitly can come out. How can you extract that intent? Because once that intent is extracted to evaluation criteria, then like that agent, whether I'm like in ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or whatever, UI tool, that can then start to be like, okay, I'm going to learn over time how to improve Eric's customer note agent. But right now, doing that is like this very manual process of me essentially being a prompt engineer. And I can only do it because I know that I know about the stuff under the hood. But how do I enable the person who doesn't know about the stuff under the hood just to do this in natural language and still get a really good outcome that they say, okay, yeah, my like customer notes can go out today and I don't have to like review them or edit them as much, right? That's where I think we'll start to see the time savings potential of Gen AI come.
Yeah, one thing I'd
Well,
love
I don't
to
know if that makes sense, but musings of Eric.
I think it makes sense. I'd love to see like in ChatGPT, if you have like a custom GPT where, you save instructions. I love voice mode. I love it because when you're on the go, I would love to be able to use voice just to say, make it a bit more like this. And then it automatically updates instructions. That would be awesome because then you get.
I mean, we're going to be good friends. That's exactly like the voice interaction mode is so game changing. Like I'm not an investor in Whisper, but like I wish I was an investor in Whisper. But like, right? Have you guys used Whisper Flow at all?
It's so good.
For me, it's like it's game changing for like at least for like my vibe coding workflows. Like I'm just sitting here like a crazy man, like walking around the house with my laptop, talking to it. Like, no, move the button to the left a little bit. Like I don't really like it. It's kind of the wrong shade of blue. Like that's actual conversations I have with my computer now. And like that voice interaction mode is like voice in, text back is actually for me surprisingly effective. I think Laurie, you're absolutely right. As soon as we can enable that and like what's the UX of how it responds is maybe not necessarily voice because it's actually hard to listen to people. It's easy, at least for me, like it's much harder. I'd much rather see a written word than listen to someone for 2 minutes. That's just how my brain works. But I'm sure other people have different, there's like different learning styles and these different approaches out there. Like someone might like, no, I need pictures, or no, it's better for me to listen. And it'll be really cool to get these interaction modes working.
Amazing. Let's see where it's gonna go.
We'll find out.
Cool. Thank you, Eric. It was
Of
amazing.
course. Yeah. Excited to see the episode on the other side.
Amazing.